Okay, so we just talked about two modes of revelation that happen. There's communication and there's manifestation. And we're going to look at kind of another way of categorizing revelation, different varieties of revelation that are described. And these are more like the concrete, how revelation plays out when we see different things happening in the Bible. Craig cites William J. Abraham, Northern Irish theologian, analytic, philosopher, and Methodist pastor. And Abraham, in his book Crossing the Threshold of Divine Revelation, he says, "As with human agents, God is made known through what he does. Revelation is therefore a polymorphous rather than a monomorphous activity. It supervenes on those acts that disclose the character, nature, and purposes of the agent in question." So of course, polymorphous is going to mean that it comes in many different forms. Monomorphous means one form. So you're saying revelation is something that it's not just coming in one form, that it comes in many different forms. And this word is really interesting, supervenes. In philosophy, the word supervene would be said of a fact or a property, to be entailed by or consequent on the existence or establishment of another. So I could use the example here that an image supervenes upon the brush strokes that compose it. The image supervenes upon the brush strokes. It is consequent on the existence of the brush strokes. You can't have the image without the brush strokes that make it. The image isn't the brush strokes, and the brush strokes aren't the image, but the brush strokes do make up the image. In a similar way, you can say that revelation, the property of revelation, it's dependent on its base properties. Divine acts are not revelation, and the revelation isn't the divine act. The divine acts are the things that God does, though. They're what he causes to happen, and revelation arises from that. God's revelation is the meaning and the significance that arises from the divine acts which God does. So when God sends someone a dream in the Bible, the dream is not the revelation, but the dream does entail the revelation. The revelation is the meaning or the significance to the dream. The dream is the divine act, and revelation is what God has revealed about himself through that divine act. So back to the idea of polymorphous and monomorphous. Abraham is saying that these acts that disclose the character and nature and purposes of God are not just of one form. In the Bible, these acts come in a variety of forms. Another point I'd like to make, because we're going to be mentioning general and special revelation coming up here, is that general and special revelation are not manifestation versus communication. You shouldn't think of these as being the same thing. Think of them as like a different way of categorizing what revelation is. General and special revelation have more to do with the scope of revelation, and that general revelation is available to all people at all times, whereas special revelation is going to be specific, targeted at. Manifestation and communication, on the other hand, are more focused on the mode and the mechanic of how revelation occurs. So we shouldn't mix them up, but there is going to be some overlap between these categories as we talk through different varieties here. So the first theologian we're going to look at is Herman Bavinck, who you'll remember from, I think, our second episode. Bavinck would first say that God reveals himself and his attributes both through nature and through history. And this would fall pretty well under the popular category of general revelation. And if you remember, in Mavrod's way of thinking about revelation, general revelation would be a good example of manifestation, how God manifests himself and reveals his attributes. And last time we talked about how for Mavrod's, he wouldn't say that manifestation is just purely a vague thing, but that manifestation can also come with propositional truths. And so yes, God is manifesting himself. He's making himself known, both in nature and the unfolding of history. But even through that manifestation, there are specific propositional truths, like attributes of God, that God is powerful and wise and glorious. And these are all specific propositions which you can derive from general revelation. Moving on, Bavinck would also talk about kinds of special revelation. So the first one would be theophany. Theophany is direct appearances of God to humans. Examples of this would be like the burning bush, the angel of the Lord, God appearing to Abraham. And of course, the highest form would be Jesus Christ and his incarnation. Jesus Christ coming to earth, taking on human form, and dwelling among us. For Mavrod's, theophany would be an example of manifestation. Now, there could be a communication component because of the verbal nature. So like when Jesus is manifest and dwelling among us, he obviously spoke and said many things, and so that's verbal communication. But the actual theophany itself would be an example of manifestation. So the next kind of special revelation would be prophecy, which is defined as God's communication of his thoughts to humans. Within prophecy, we're going to have two different forms. So there's the lower form, which includes Manticism, and then the higher form, which would be the prophetic messengers. So Manticism is probably going to be the rarest word that you hear today. It's your 1 in 100 million word. And it just means the practice of divination, or divination practices. Now, not all divination in the Bible is bad. There were forms of divination that God approved and which he used for communicating his revelation. So some good examples of mantic or divination practices would be like casting lots. That's either like the drawing straws or rolling dice. Think about Jonah when he's on the ship and the sailors cast lots to determine that it's him that's the cause of the storm. Or you've got like the Urim and Thummim, which are probably stones that were in the pouch on the high priest's breastplate, and he could reach in and draw one of those out, and depending on which one he drew, it could be a yes or no. That might be what the Urim and the Thummim are. Also dreams and visions, dreams probably being when you're asleep, visions being like a waking dream that you have while you're conscious. And then you have the higher form of prophecy, which would be the interior illumination of God's prophetic messengers. Interior illumination, this is God putting his message, making that known to the prophets so that they can verbally communicate that with the people around them. And obviously the highest form of this would again be Jesus. John 1:18 says, "No one has seen God at any time. The one and only God, the one who is in the bosom of the Father," it's Jesus, "that one has made him known." And again, coming back to Mavrodes every time so we can kind of see the overlap of these categories. For Mavrodes, he would classify prophecy often as communication, especially when you have the prophets and they're communicating a verbal message to people. But then you can also have manifestation for those non-verbal or non-speech acts, like casting the lot or Urim Thummim. So the last category here for Bavinck would be miracles. Miracles are going to be extraordinary acts of divine power that seemingly go beyond the ordinary course of nature and serve as signs of God's presence and power. Craig doesn't mention it in here, but again, I think the highest form has got to be Jesus, both through his miraculous incarnation, his birth, and also just the many miracles that he worked in his ministry. I don't think that there's anything more miraculous than what Jesus did while he was here. And for Mavrodes, miracles would be an obvious example of manifestation, God manifesting him, making known both his power and his presence through these divine acts. Miracles themselves are not usually verbal in nature, and so it would be more manifestation instead of communication. So I'm interested to see what Craig explains more about miracles as we get to some future section and as those hopefully get touched upon. So I've listened to a couple different explanations of miracles. The one that stands out the most would probably be a discussion of miracles by Jonathan Pageau, and he's coming from an Eastern Orthodox tradition of Christianity. But in that discussion, this idea of miracles is not only being things that are outside of the laws of nature, but the miracles could be things that happen perfectly within the laws of nature. And it's not so much to do about it being in or outside of those laws, but it has to do with the meaning and the sign that the miracle serves as. And he gave probably a couple different examples of things that it wasn't that they couldn't be explained. They clearly had explanations to them, but the sort of extraordinary coincidence or timing of the thing, where it was so obvious to the person who encountered the miracle that it was a sign and what it specifically meant, that there's just no question about it, that they clearly saw it as a miracle, even though it might have been something that was perfectly explainable. And I feel like I've even had that in my life, and you can probably think of yourself or maybe others that you know that just have something that happens with such perfect coincidence or timing that it just leaves you shocked and stunned. So that's a different sort of idea for like non-miraculous miracles. I don't know what you think about that concept. You should tell me in the comments. And maybe we can get some clarification as we continue working through this systematic theology. But let's move on for now. So a contrasting example that Craig gives is of Wolfhart Pannenberg, and he has a different sort of categorization for these varieties of revelation. So Pannenberg would categorize revelation into 5 different categories. The first one that he would put would be Manticism, and he would split that up between inductive, which is kind of drawing your conclusions from observations, and that would be like casting lots, where there is something that happens, and you observe it, and you draw some conclusion from that. So I cast the lot, I observe the result, and then I infer that Jonah is the guilty party, and he's the reason for the storm. And the other half would be intuitive Manticism, and intuition is your subconscious gut feeling, and he would classify dreams, visions, and prophetic trances into that. Things where you are receiving information, but it's not really through reasoning. And the other 4 categories would be theophanies, which we've already talked about, but then also some stranger categories. So the third category would be God communicating his divine name to Moses, so like at the burning bush when he reveals his name. 4, revelation of the will of God at Mount Sinai, so like the giving of the law, and then other revelatory historical events, miraculous or not, accompanied by prophetic words. And Craig raises the critique here to Pannenberg's categorizing of these. He would say it's not clear that these are really 5 distinct forms of revelation, rather than merely examples of significant revelatory events in the Old Testament. Craig explains that he doesn't really see a difference in form between the 3rd and 4th categories here with God communicating. He also points out that Pannenberg would say that the theophanies, God communicating his divine name, and the historical events, that they all have God as both the one doing the communicating and also the subject of the communication, that he's revealing himself. So again, it's hard to see how these are really good categories or ways to break up what revelation is, and these are more like different examples that happen in the Old Testament. And then coming to the end here, the last sort of schema of categories or varieties of revelation that we're going to look at is Jewish apocalyptic revelation. And this is one that Craig points out falls well outside of Mavrod's categorization of communication and manifestation. So the first half of this apocalyptic concept would be the disclosure of the eschatological future. Eschatological meaning to do with the last things. So the seer receives a vision, right? God is communicating to them through a vision. And he's communicating about the last things, about the end times, the final days. So this could align well with the communication model for Mavrod's. And the second piece would be the future occurrence of what's foreseen. This is the final manifestation of the thing that was communicated. This is the fulfilling of promises. And so this could also strongly match to manifestation, where it's the actual event that happens, that is the revelation. Like when Jesus finally appears, that this is an actual act, an event that takes place, and it's the revelation, as opposed to some verbal component. So as I was reading this, it was not really clear to me why this didn't fit Mavrod's schemes, because it points out that the disclosing the events that are going to happen, the communication of that fits with communication, and that the actual those events happening, what they said was going to happen, did happen, that could match very strongly with manifestation. So it wasn't really obvious to me why this wouldn't fit Mavrod's scheme. So I think the important thing is that Mavrod's models primarily describe how God reveals, either through communication, the speech acts, the telling, the asserting, God communicating, and also through manifestation, him making things perceivable, showing himself, his works, his miracles. But again, these are both methods for how God reveals. And at least how I'm seeing this and trying to work this out, it seems like the Jewish apocalyptic idea of revelation is not so much about the how, but it's about God fulfilling his plan and keeping his promise. So it's not about God telling you what he's going to do, or even about showing or doing that thing, but more about the journey and the arc that happened through those two things. That there was a plan and it was done. There was a promise and it was kept. That God has fulfilled all things. So again, I'm not super sure that I fully understand this point, because again, the fulfilling does seem super wrapped up with the manifestation part, the actual God completing the thing. But it seems to me that it has more to do with the whole package deal of everything. So in that sense, it could be talking about more than just mere communication or manifestation. And let me know what you think about that piece. And so here's the grand conclusion that Craig comes to at the end of this section. Divine communication is one mode of biblical revelation. Craig says here, despite contemporary theology's proclivity towards the manifestation model as the mode of God's self-revelation, it is indisputable that in the Bible, divine revelation often takes place through verbal communication, particularly to and through prophets. So there you go. We have communication, we have manifestation. You can't say that there's just manifestation. Communication is clearly a thing that the Bible talks about and is a very prominent mode for God to reveal himself to people. So in the next section, we're going to build on this, and we're going to talk about Scripture itself as divine communication. And I'll see you there.